Something felt slightly off for weeks, just enough to register, not enough to trigger immediate alarm. At first, there wasn't a dramatic reaction from the public because it isn't unusual for royal children to miss the occasional appearance. Schedules shift, priorities change, and in a family that lives under constant scrutiny, privacy isn't a luxury, it's a strategy. Public visibility always evolves over time, but then the absences didn't stop. They stretched on, and that's when the quiet began to feel intentional. Because the child who was once the most recognizable spark at public events, Prince Louis, was suddenly no longer there. No school photographs were released, no balcony moments, no quick flashes of mischief or personality that royal watchers had grown used to like punctuation marks inside carefully staged ceremony. What made it more unsettling was the way it happened. No big announcement, no clear explanation, just silence. And when silence lasts long enough, it stops being empty space. It becomes a question. After enough time passed for that question to spread, the palace responded, not loudly but carefully. The statement was cautious, protective, and polished to perfection. It sounded reassuring, yet offered no real detail, controlled, methodical. And what stood out most wasn't what they said, it was what they deliberately did not say. The omissions became the clue. People began tracing the timeline with sharper attention, noticing small changes they had once ignored. Images that used to include all three children now felt curated, their compositions subtly adjusted. Public messaging shifted not suddenly, but gradually, like the monarchy quietly rewriting its own framing. Not everyone noticed at first. Most people don't notice an absence until it repeats, then repeats again until the question becomes unavoidable. Why had the youngest face of the modern monarchy quietly disappeared from view? This wasn't about wild rumors. It came down to patterns, small, visible alterations that only made sense when assembled together, moments that looked normal in real time but felt different when replayed with hindsight. Once that pattern revealed itself, it became difficult to unsee. As the official calendar moved forward, the pattern sharpened. There was Prince George. Princess Charlotte stood beside him, and the space where Louis would normally be was unmistakably empty. No explanation followed, not even a casual mention, not even a carefully selected photograph released later to soften the gap. Gradually, the absence of acknowledgement began to feel deliberate rather than accidental. Then came a string of major royal moments, events heavy with symbolism. The Commonwealth Day service. Trooping the Colour, Remembrance Sunday, each one meticulously staged, each one steeped in meaning, and each time the Wales family appeared composed and united, yet visibly missing the element that used to be there. To many viewers it might have seemed minor, but for those who are used to reading royal iconography, positioning is never random, presence is a message. The monarchy communicates not only through speeches but through choreography, and here the choreography had changed. At that point, the question was no longer whether Louis was absent. The question was why the absence had become consistent. Was this simply a parenting decision, a temporary adjustment, or was something deeper unfolding behind palace walls? One missed appearance doesn't worry people, patterns do. The palace issued another statement, short, crisp, carefully detached. It referenced the child's welfare and spoke of time away from official duties. No dramatic language, no expanded explanation. To the general public, it sounded comforting. But to those familiar with royal communication, the restraint was loud because when official language offers reassurance without context, it often signals that the full picture is being intentionally withheld. And so the questions grew more complicated. In royal life, timing is almost never coincidence, and control is rarely surrendered, which meant the wording and what it avoided mattered. There was no clear return date, no explicit promise that this was temporary. Instead, it read like a quiet confirmation that something had changed, and history suggests that once royal children step back from public view, it is rarely simple to step forward again. That brings attention back to a moment many people didn't question at the time, the last balcony appearance. On the surface, it looked routine, national celebration, smiles, waves, and that familiar rhythm performed for the cameras. But rewatched later, it felt different. Prince Louis, typically animated and impossible to overlook, seemed unusually quiet. His posture looked more rigid, his movements smaller. It wasn't playful restlessness, and it wasn't excitement either. It looked like restraint. Some observers later suggested it resembled emotional overload, something children can experience in highly stimulating ceremonial environments. But whatever the explanation, the contrast was striking. A subtle departure from the public persona people thought they knew. Then there was Catherine, poised, composed, perfectly in role, and yet for a split second her expression shifted. She looked at her son in a way that wasn't theatrical and wasn't for the cameras. It was maternal, a quiet, private check-in hidden inside a public performance. "Are you okay?" It lasted barely a moment, easy to miss in real time but difficult to ignore in hindsight. Prince William, too, seemed more subdued that day. Small choices, positioning, movement, where attention fell, details that appeared incidental at first, began to look more deliberate when placed against everything that followed. Then came the detail that altered the mood entirely. Photographers later suggested there were quiet restrictions around capturing Louis that day: no close-ups, no prolonged focus, no lingering frames that might invite scrutiny. And restrictions like that are never random. They suggest concern, they suggest protection. And once that became part of the story, the event began to read differently. Because when the palace finally addressed the situation, it didn't reveal a sudden problem. It validated a decision, a conscious shift, and decisions like that don't happen overnight. They develop gradually, discussed privately, weighed carefully, then executed quietly. So what caused it? Who pushed for the change? And why did it solidify when it did? Because this story doesn't end with a statement, it becomes more complex. For weeks, something had been unfolding in plain sight. No familiar presence, no school appearances, no balcony waves, no impulsive moments that once pulled attention toward him. The youngest, and often the liveliest, member of the family had quietly vanished from view without a clear narrative. No detailed reassurance, no timeline, only measured words placed with care. At first, many assumed it was temporary, a child resting, a family protecting privacy. But as weeks turned to months, the absence became harder to explain as ordinary. Attention shifted from what was shown to what was missing. In royal life, headlines often dominate. This time, the absence itself became the headline. When the palace spoke again, the message was brief, managed, polished. Yet instead of closing the conversation, it deepened uncertainty. Because behind those careful sentences was the sense of rising concern, private deliberation, and a decision that quietly altered the rules of visibility. For royal watchers, the pattern became unmistakable. Event after event, the Wales family appeared steady and united. Prince George stood beside his father with growing confidence. Princess Charlotte remained composed beyond her years. But the space that once held Louis's energy stayed empty and no one addressed it. No extra photographs were released afterward. No passing reference to soften the change. Presence in an institution built on symbolism is deliberate. Visibility is messaging, and changes in visibility are rarely accidental. Behind the scenes, reports suggested Catherine had grown increasingly wary of intense publicity for Louis. Not defiant, not confrontational, protective. She reportedly pushed for softer routines, reduced exposure, fewer high-pressure engagements, not to reject the institution but to adapt it to her child's needs. Public choreography began to give way to private conversations. Schedules were reconsidered, exposure weighed more carefully. There was no official confirmation, only a gradual shift that began to make sense when viewed as a whole. Slow it down, give him space, let a child breathe outside ceremony. But institutions like the monarchy do not change easily. Advisors think in optics, in headlines, in speculation, in the noise absence creates. Tradition moves carefully, sometimes painfully slowly. And yet Catherine's position, by many accounts, did not soften because the focus had shifted away from image management. This was no longer about perception, it was about well-being, and crucially, she wasn't alone. Prince William, shaped by duty and structure, was said to have undergone a subtle but meaningful shift as well, changing the question from how will this appear to what is the cost? Because when the heir to the throne begins prioritizing impact over optics, the entire conversation changes. Private discussions reportedly became more serious and more intimate, less procedural. Sources claim that for the first time, William began to see the weight of the throne not only as inheritance, but as pressure, and pressure has consequences, especially for a child. External experts were quietly consulted at Catherine's request, not with dramatic framing or public labels, but for guidance. The advice, according to sources, was measured and responsible. Reduce exposure, increase privacy, slow the pace. Nothing sensational, nothing remainant, just deliberate. And once that perspective entered the decision-making, the timeline began to look less coincidental. This was never meant to be a spectacle. It needed care, not cameras. But then the internal conflict reportedly intensified. Communications teams evaluated backlash. Advisors measured perception. Optics were weighed again and again, and time passed. That delay, according to insiders, weighed heavily on Catherine, not because she was afraid, but because the choice felt painfully obvious to her: protect the child or protect the image. In her mind, the decision was already made. There was no dramatic showdown, no staged explanation. Instead, the royal picture simply began to change. Louis's presence faded without a public narrative or fixed timeline, and yet it was not merely a disappearance. It felt like a deeper recalibration within an institution built on tradition, a test of expectation, devotion, and the strength of silence before it breaks. Then came what insiders later described as a key night. Engagements for the following week were quietly crossed off the calendar with no explanation and no rescheduled dates. Catherine withdrew completely, more fully than at any point since entering royal life. No public appearances, no digital footprint, a total retreat that was quiet but unmistakable. It didn't go unnoticed, and what followed only deepened the questions. There were no briefings, no background narratives fed to soften the story. And within palace walls, concern reportedly sharpened into something closer to alarm. Sources suggested medical experts emphasized urgency, not theatrically but clinically, warning that delays could make things harder. In that moment, the discussion stopped being about optics altogether. It became about responsibility. That shift removed any remaining ambiguity for William. This was no longer vague worry. It was professional guidance, clear, organized, difficult to misunderstand. And then fragments of information began to surface in the press. Nothing confirmed, no documents, no official names, just insinuations, enough to suggest a line had been crossed. Speculation emerged that Prince Louis might be facing something requiring more privacy and adjusted routines. Many dismissed it as tabloid noise, but insiders reportedly felt uneasy about the timing, because the rumors surfaced soon after private conversations intended to remain confidential. And silence creates space, often not because attention is wanted, but because space invites interpretation. No leak was ever officially confirmed, but one reality became difficult to deny: control was slipping. And even the appearance of losing control can destabilize an institution that survives on precision and choreography. The response was methodical. Information channels narrowed, meeting locations shifted, attendance lists shortened, briefings reduced to the bare minimum. Access tightened because institutions close ranks when trust begins to erode. But tightening control can also increase pressure, and that pressure was now rising on multiple fronts. So William and Catherine reportedly adjusted their approach, not rebellious, not reckless, but more deliberate, more self-contained, defensive in the way parents become defensive when the stakes are their child. During this uncertain period, one quiet voice reportedly gained weight in private family discussions, a longtime caregiver who had known Louis in his earliest years. She gave no interviews, made no public remarks, offered only personal observations, and what she described wasn't a crisis. It was sensitivity, how constant attention can overstimulate a young child, how ceremonial repetition can become overwhelming, how sometimes stability matters more than performance. These weren't scandalous claims, just human truths often erased by headlines. Then came what many assumed would finally end speculation, not an explanation, just a statement. A handful of carefully constructed lines reached the media, framing the decision as support for Prince Louis's emotional development and overall well-being, and referencing a temporary adjustment to his public role. No cause was named, no timeline offered, no medical detail provided, and in royal communication, precision like that is never accidental. Every word is weighed. Every omission chosen. It didn't announce a crisis, it validated a decision. For those who tracked the pattern from the beginning, it didn't feel like new information, it felt like the final link in a chain. One phrase drew particular attention: emotional health. It didn't function as an explanation so much as a boundary, enough to acknowledge that something needed attention but not enough to invite interference. Concern without access, reassurance without detail. Public reactions split quickly. Some praised the move as compassionate, modern, even overdue, an acknowledgement of pressures children face under scrutiny. Others were frustrated by the ambiguity, ironing the lack of specifics and the absence of deadlines. Online speculation intensified almost immediately, but William and Catherine offered nothing further: no interviews, no additional remarks, no carefully staged photographs to soften the narrative. That stillness felt deliberate, especially for a couple often associated with a more approachable style. Perhaps it wasn't simply restraint, perhaps it was resolve. Because the future of Prince Louis's public life now sits in uncertainty. There has been no expectation-setting language, no schedule for return, no indication of how long this adjustment will last, only space. The palace presents it as a pause, yet history suggests royal pauses are rarely neutral. They often mark transitions, quiet shifts, subtle redefinitions of role. And this story at its core is about more than a missing appearance. It is about limits, how much tradition can reasonably demand of a child, when protection must outweigh duty, and whether safeguarding a child can take precedence over serving the sovereign in a modern monarchy. The answer to that question affects more than one family calendar. Some in royal circles believe this moment may carry generational consequences, not because of scandal, not because of controversy, but because it sets precedent. And whenever precedent shifts inside a monarchy, history pays attention. That is why some have looked backward for context. Queen Elizabeth II was often described by those close to her as deeply reflective, almost philosophical. She understood emotional toll, yet valued continuity. Biographers have written about private discussions she held with trusted advisors regarding tradition, symbolism, and the psychological burden of being born into duty, not as prophecy or strategy, but as perception and awareness of the human cost beneath the crown. A retired lady-in-waiting once recalled a private conversation between Elizabeth and Catherine early in Catherine's royal life. The moment was casual, the tone measured, and no instructions were given, only a question about balance. How do you preserve the institution without losing the people inside it? At the time, it may have sounded abstract, Now it feels immediate because the conflict between continuity and compassion is no longer theoretical. If the monarchy is being asked to adapt for the well-being of a child, then it is being tested. And perhaps that is why this moment matters, not because a child is absent, but because an institution may be evolving. It was never framed as a warning, it was never offered as prophecy. It was simply an observation born of experience. Royal obligation is not distributed evenly, and visibility, no matter how polished, comes at a price. Sometimes the child most impacted by scrutiny is the one least prepared to carry it. Those thoughts may have sounded philosophical once, now they feel heavy. And the real conflict is not destiny, it is decision. Is Prince Louis being spared from pressures others endured? Is this a gentle correction by parents determined not to repeat old patterns? Or is it a quiet admission that some traditions demand more than is reasonable, because the crown is not light, and it doesn't only press down on the one meant to inherit it? Sometimes the ones not meant to bear it at all feel its weight the most, and that is the reality the monarchy now seems to be navigating, carefully, slowly, silently, because silence can be protection, but it can also be the first sign of change, and only time will reveal which this moment truly is.